Welcome everybody to the second in our series related to FSMA 204. We are now days away from having a final rule with that deadline fast approaching on November 7th. And so with the limited time that we have left until that date, Jason and I wanted to talk about a couple of questions, 5 questions that you can use to assess your readiness for that final regulation. Before we hop into our content, a quick housekeeping item. If you have questions throughout the presentation, we want to hear them. We ask that you submit them, however, in the Q&A section that we have circled there in red instead of in the chat. Just makes it easier for Jason and I to access everything in one place and not to have to bounce around. So if you have questions, please put them in there and we will address them either throughout the presentation as they come up, or we also have some time set aside at the end. So with that, let's talk about that agenda. It's really simple, really straightforward today. We're going to do a FSMA 101, a quick overview of FSMA 204. Then we'll jump into those 5 questions to assess your readiness, and we will wrap at the end with some time for Q&A. And hopefully we'll get everybody out of here on time. So let's jump right in and talk about FSMA 204. What is it? Well, when we boil it down to its core, FSMA 204 is an extension of the Food Safety and Modernization Act. That's the FSMA piece. And the 204 is specific to the record keeping of traceability records, so how those records are maintained. There's a couple of elements to it that I like to call out. The first one is the 24-hour turnaround time for a request. 24 hours, not a lot of time there to be prepared to respond and turn around those records. And then the second piece is the direction on how those data and records need to be organized. The key there being that it must be electronic and not manual. I put a couple of terms here at the bottom that are important to know. So we have the FTL, that is the food traceability list. It's basically the list of all of the items that will fall under this regulation. The second term there, CTE, that is the critical tracking events. They are essentially the places within the supply chain where information is going to need to be captured. And then exactly what that information is, what data needs to be captured at what time, that's going to be your KDEs, the key data elements. And we're going to unpack these more. We'll get into more detail with these as we go through. But suffice it to say that if we wanted to put FSMA 204 in a nutshell, this would be the slide that I would use. So why does it matter? Why are we talking about this today? Well, if we look at a timeline of where we are today, we are a mere matter of days away from that final ruling that will happen on November 7th. At that point, we will or we should have that final rule published in the Federal Register. And once that happens, there's going to be a 60-day waiting period per the proposal before it's officially applied to the FTL. So before that regulation kind of goes into play, with that 60 days, that's going to put us at January 2023. At that point, the agency will set the compliance date to 2 years after the effective date. So that's going to bring us all the way out to January 2025. So awesome. We still have a lot of time. But most of us that have been in the space long enough know that those 2 years are going to go by in the blink of an eye, especially when we think about the effort that's going to be required to collect all of this information and organize it and set up the infrastructure for sharing that data across trading partners. So it's quite a lofty goal to have all of that happening within that 2-year time frame, or 2 years and 60 days. But everything I'm going to be talking about today is, getting you all of the information, but also sharing with you areas where we can help. So iTrade is here. We're happy to help. If you have gaps, if there's things that you find after the session or as we go through the questions that you feel you need to work on, we are, of course, here. We're happy to engage with you, help wherever we can. The good news is that we have been doing this for a very long time. We've been in this traceability space for years and years, participating in working groups, designing and executing solutions, engaging on these regulations wherever we can. So this is not a new space to us. We are happy to jump on the phone with you if you have questions or unique cases or whatever it might be. The odds are that we have resources internally that can help you and address those questions. So that brings me to our 5 questions that we're providing to you to help you to assess your readiness for FSMA 204. The first one is pretty obvious. So the first thing we need to figure out is, will this impact me? Will 204 impact my business? If the answer is no, great, you're going to be all set. But if the answer is yes, we're going to have more that we need to do. So first, we need to answer this question. And to do that, we need to start with a couple of things. So I have a little checklist here. So first is understanding the FTL, that food traceability list. And if we look at that list as it stands today, there are some expected items on there. So we have our leafy greens, our cucumbers, our herbs, a lot of the unsurprising, very expected things to see on there. But then we also have fresh cut. So we have fresh cut fruits and vegetables, ready to eat deli salads. We also have cheeses and shell eggs, number of fin fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and then of course the center store type items like our nut butters, our tree nut and peanut butters. Really important to note at the bottom here that this rule is intended to apply not just to the growers and shippers of these items, but anyone who is involved in the supply chain. So manufacturers, processing, packing, holding foods, everyone is on the hook for this regulation. So, it's important to both understand what's on the FTL list and also where we fall in that process. The other thing that's important to note are the exceptions. And these are things where if an item, and I love to use the colored greens example because colored greens are leafy greens, so technically they would be on the FTL. But if that item is also exempt from the FTL, then we would not need to keep that information. So RCR, rarely consumed raw, colored greens fall into this category. And because of that, they are not required to capture the information per the regulation. Another example of that would be foods that have a kill step as part of the overall processing. So certain things that happen to those products will make them exempt from the FTL FSMA 204 regulation. The other thing that can cause an exemption is the person within the supply chain. So certain small originators will not fall under the regulation. Nonprofits, transporters. This is by no means an exhaustive list here. We're just trying to illustrate some examples. So it's really important that as you review these things, you're reviewing not just the FTL, but also the exemptions in depth to make sure that you don't qualify or you do qualify for those. So with that, that checks the first 2 boxes here, understanding the FTL, understanding the exemptions, and then applying that to your own business, right? So looking at your catalog. In our last session, we provided some resources in the form of a format that you can use for collecting this information. This allows you to, if you're an iTrade customer, dump out your catalog, export out your catalog, and start to fill out this information and capture anywhere that we are or aren't under the FTL regulation. So you can see that I've kind of highlighted those here with 3 examples. The first here is romaine lettuce hearts. These are going to fall under that leafy greens category. We also have another variation, which is a 3-pack of romaine lettuce, also under that leafy greens category. But when it comes to my collard greens, as we just discussed, those are going to be RCR, so they're not going to be on the FTL. So going through and doing this with all of your catalog items so that you have that full visibility into exactly where you're impacted, if you're impacted under this first question. From there, the next most important step, and I would argue very important step here, is going to be identifying the person that's going to be responsible for this. So hopefully we've even identified them before we've gone through that first exercise in looking at the FTL list. But really important, there's going to be a lot involved to this regulation. So having somebody who is responsible for that, having somebody who's appointed to taking care of that is going to be a really important step to the overall readiness process. Once we have a resource in place and once we know that we need to pay attention to FSMA 204, that it's going to impact us, We'll have that list of items that will fall on the FTL. And the next step is, of course, figuring out what data we need associated with each of those items. And because the regulation is complex, this is not as straightforward as we would hope or as it would seem, because in order to understand the data that you need for each of those items, you need to really understand what we mean when we talk about the CTEs and the KDEs. And so to expand a little bit on CTEs, these are the critical tracking events. So these are the steps within the overall supply chain for those products. And we can see them here, growing, receiving, shipping, creating, transformation. And so if I am growing a product, I'm going to be responsible for those grower KDEs. I may also be responsible for shipping KDEs and for additional KDEs depending on the product itself. So for sprout growers, there's going to be some additional KDEs required. So understanding if I am trading sprouts, if I'm growing sprouts, I need to really understand what's going to be required of me for those KDEs. Same is true of receiving. There are receiving KDEs, but this one is also a bit complex because there is also something called a first receiver. This is essentially the first person other than the farm or the grower who purchases and takes physical possession of a listed food. So this would not qualify for someone like a broker who doesn't take physical possession. This is going to be the first person to purchase and take physical possession of a food. There are some exceptions to this as well. So ready-to-eat deli salads don't have first receivers. If something is coming from a fishing vessel, there's going to be different information required. So it does get complex here as well. And this is where having that person to kind of dig through and really understand what's going to be required of the regulation is going to be really important. A little less complex when it comes to shipping KDEs and to creation KDEs and transformation KDEs. Not as much nuance to those categories, but still really important information that needs to be captured and shared. When we put it all together, so we have an example workflow here where we have whole romaine that is being processed into fresh cut romaine and sold to a customer. And in this example, we can see that the first person in the example here is going to be responsible for a number of different steps, a number of different CTEs here. They have the grower KDEs, shipping KDEs to the cooler. At the cooler, they're going to be responsible for receiving and shipping KDEs. And then on the on-farm packer at the packing house, they're going to be responsible for those receiving and shipping KDEs. So a lot of information for a single person. And then once we move into that purchase and transfer of product, then we have our produce processor who's going to need those first receiver KDEs along with the receiving KDEs. And because they are transforming that into fresh cut romaine, we also have the transformation KDEs here. When we get to our customer, they're going to need those receiving KDEs, and that completes that kind of workflow there. Now, that is fairly straightforward for this product, but when we think about a single person, so let's just look at the customer for now. In that workflow, it's also really important to start with your catalog items because this information can change based on each of the different items on your catalog. So for example, the fresh cut romaine for this customer, they know they're responsible for receiving KDEs, but they also might be buying whole romaine direct from the grower. And in that case, they're going to be the first person to purchase and take possession of that product. So not only do they need receiving KDEs for these products, they need receiving and first receiver KDEs for a different set of products that they might be sourcing straight from the grower. They also might be purchasing products that aren't covered on the FTL. So milk, as an example here, is not on the FTL. They don't need to capture that additional information there. But when we look at milk that is being transformed and manufactured and combined with other ingredients into a soft cheese, now that changes the information that we need to capture. So there is a lot of complexity to this because of the variation that we see in the various ways that products make their way to from farm to fork. And so all of that needs to be accounted for when we look at the regulation. This can be made further complex if this is not the stopping point and if this customer then is selling forward or there are additional steps before that reaches our retail or restaurant locations. So this is a big step, understanding all of that complexity and documenting all of that complexity. And again, in that resource that we shared in the first session, and that's available to anyone today as well, you're going to be able to not only capture the products that fall on the FTL, but also capture that information for each product. Where do I fall in that overall flow? What KDEs am I responsible for based on the CTEs of that flow for me? And also having the ability to denote things like additional KDEs. So we saw the sprouts example, or if food is obtained from a fishing vessel, or if there are exceptions like the RCR example that I shared with you earlier. So that brings us to question number 4, which is, am I prepared? Do I have the means to capture the data that's going to be required? So we know the data that's going to be required. Do I have the ability to get it? And this is a quick word cloud that we kind of threw together here that illustrates all of the different types of KDEs across those CTE categories. And some of the big ones that pop out are some of the more difficult ones to obtain, like your traceability lot codes, your harvest date and time, some of those other examples in there. And this is where I'm going to pull up our solution suite here for iTrade, because when we look at our solution suite, we put it into 2 kind of columns here. So there are some of our products that we have been doing for many, many years, 10 plus years. And then there are some that are more recent. But regardless of which of the columns it falls into, all of our traceability solutions either focus on the capture of data or on the sharing and analysis of data. And so for this first question, for question number 4, do I have the ability to capture that data? This is where we want to focus on our labeling solution. Because when we look at, lettuce, for example, what we're looking at here, romaine salad mix, we need to have that traceability lot code, and we need to have that date information and, where it came from and when it was harvested. And all of that is often some of the more difficult information to come by simply because of the complexity of those harvest operations. And with iTrade's out-of-the-box labeling solution, we have the harmonized PTI case labeling format. So wherever possible in our solutions, we try to stick to, the standards. And so the example of the PTI case label is a great one. This is going to contain all of the information that we need to capture at that step. It's also going to have that GS1128 barcode that's going to be scannable. So as we move through the process, other folks will be able to capture that information as well. And then we also have the palette labels. So these 2 are going to be important when we start to put the full picture together of creating those data records, those digital records for FSMA 204. But this is going to satisfy our ability to kind of capture that detail that we need at this stage. From there, that brings us to our last question, question number 5. Do I have the means to share the data required? And this is, again, taking what is maybe exists on a physical label and digitizing that so that we're able to share that with our trading partners and share that to the correct trading partners as well. And so if we look at, again, in our available for 10 plus years category, these are things we've been doing for many, many years, we have our transit palletized ASN solution. So essentially what this is a standard ASN that might have a number of data fields on it about the order that's being shipped, and we are making that more robust and adding to that all of these traceability fields that are going to be required for that regulation and for other purposes too. We have a lot of buyers that are using this to do some different and exciting things, but this will allow us to share the data that we need that we've captured in that step number 4. And the way that that kind of works is we're going to be using those PTI case labels. We're going to be using those pallet labels, and then we're going to be combining all of that information at the PO level. So this is how we are able to share this with the correct trading partners. This is how my buyer is going to know that on this PO, they received these pallets, and these pallets each contained these cases with these unique traceability attributes. And so it's all going to come together in this step. This is going to digitize it. This is going to make it possible to share this further downstream along the supply chain. It's also going to have some added bonuses like streamlined receiving. So as I said, these barcodes can be scanned and used to add operational efficiency in stages and steps like the receiving process or in inventory management or things like that. What we're going to end with then is the ability to take those data records and not only have them accessible and configurable for reports to export if we fall under the FSMA 204 request, but also just to have the ability to do some different things with them. So we can see some visualizations there, seeing the impact, seeing where my products are coming from and where they're going. Of course, the primary reason, the reason we're all on the phone today is that FSMA 204. So having the ability to query these records and quickly respond within that 24-hour time frame to any request for information. And so what I want to walk you through today is how we'd be able to do that. You know, we talked about 24 hours being not a lot of time, but with the ability of our TrueTrack solution, we're going to be able to really quickly pull that information. So creating a new trace data report, selecting how I want to go about this, right? If I have a lot number, perfect, I'll just plug in the lot number, but maybe I'm not starting with a lot number. Maybe it's a broader recall and I'm just looking for product information. For us, for today, we have that lot number, so we're going to start there. I'll select that, and then I can plug that in. So if I have the exact lot number, I'm going to do that, but I actually have a couple that I want to select here. So I'm going to type in the first 4 letters, click OK, and then select a number of different lots that I want to use here. We'll click Apply. And now we can see for those lots that I selected, we can see that movement. So where they started from, this is going to be our shipping warehouses. These are our receiving warehouses. Can also layer in additional data. So here I'm going to grab that map overlay and select to overlay this with some CDC information about an outbreak that's happening for leafy greens. So I will select that, click OK, and then that's going to bring us in and show us that information, that additional data with a heat map attribute on top. So this is, of course, not necessary for FSMA 204, but it does illustrate the fact that when we have this information in that digital format, it allows us to deliver more value to you, our customers. Of course, what's going to be important here is the FSMA piece of it. So understanding for these lots that I submitted, that I selected, what was impacted. So we have a total of 50,000 cases. Let me scroll down here, total of 48 POs. If I scroll down further, I can see exactly the customers that were impacted with 4 POs at Food Market. I'll click in there, see exactly those records, exactly that information, how many cases per PO, even the status of where that is. So some of these are still in transit. So all of that detail, all of that information that we'll need related to those lots. Of course, I can save these and return to them later if I'm not ready to print it out, you know, kind of creating that report and being ready to print that as I need it. Okay. So that is a quick look at that capability. We do have a couple of minutes here at the end for Q&A. So as I said in the beginning, there's a little Q&A box at the bottom. I have seen a couple of those come in, so we can address some of those questions here. But please feel free, now's a great time to submit additional questions. Okay, so let me pull those up. Okay, first question here is about the RCR. So this person wants to know how to tell if a food is considered RCR, like in your example. There's a list, I think it's called the 21 CFR. There's some more numbers at the end, but basically there's a list that you can look at, and I'll send it to that person after this call, or anyone else that is interested, please let me know. But that contains all of those RCR foods. So there's a bunch of items on there, like beans and corn and okra and different things like that. But definitely go to the source and review that reference. Another question here, do I still need to capture information if I received a product after the kill step was applied? Jason, I don't know, do you want to take that one?
The question was, can I still should repeat the question one more?
Do I need to capture information if I received a product after a kill step?
My interpretation is no on that. I do believe there is some verbiage I've read in the proposed FSMA rule about documenting the kill step. So part of FSMA that we didn't really get into too much on this call is that companies within the supply chain will need to create a traceability program records that kind of documents things like that. And so I would recommend a call out specifically about kill steps for the certain SKUs where that applies, so that you have that at least available as a reference that there was a kill step applied.
Perfect. I see a couple of requests for the RCR list also, so I'll make sure to add that person to that. People are asking if we'll get a copy of this presentation. We will send out a recording of the presentation. I also see a couple questions about the content that I mentioned, so the spreadsheet and the previous session content. If you're interested in a copy of that, please just drop your information in the Q&A section, and we'll reach out to you and get you that information. But of course, please feel free to reach out. We have a number of resources internally that we can share with you and use to help to guide you through this process. So if you haven't already received that spreadsheet, we're happy to share it with you. Okay. Well, let me, a couple more questions, but they're all in those general categories. There's one or two that are asking for a specific consult, so we'll reach out to you specifically. This is coming, right? We said November 7th will be the final date. So we have scheduled a follow-up session on November 22nd, at which point we will hopefully know, hopefully on the 7th, we'll get all of that information, and then we'll be prepared to guide you even further with our checklist to compliance, addressing any questions that we're hearing, and really starting to put the pedal to the metal on this regulation. So really happy with the attendance today. Really appreciate everybody coming out and all of the questions, and looking forward to continuing to work with everybody on this regulation.